There's a specific kind of empath almost nobody warns you about because the entire cultural conversation around empaths tends to focus on their vulnerability, their tendency to be exploited, their need for protection from people who would take advantage of their sensitivity. What almost nobody discusses is what happens once that same depth of feeling becomes paired with full, complete emotional clarity. Because what emerges from that combination isn't simply a healed version of the person who used to be exploitable. It's something considerably more formidable than the narcissist who once tried to control her. Today, we're going to examine exactly why a fully emotionally awakened empath represents something more genuinely dangerous, in a specific and important sense, than the narcissistic psychology we've spent this entire series examining. Understanding this distinction matters, both for empaths recognizing their own developing power and for anyone who's underestimated exactly what this particular kind of awakening actually produces. Let's start with a crucial clarification, because the word dangerous deserves precise definition before we go any further. We're not describing danger in the sense of cruelty, manipulation, or harm inflicted on others. Nothing about genuine emotional awakening produces those qualities, and if anything, it moves someone further away from them. We're describing danger in a specific, considerably more interesting sense: the capacity to disrupt, dismantle, and render permanently ineffective every strategy a narcissist has ever relied on, using tools a narcissist's own psychology has no framework for successfully countering. Here's the foundational difference worth understanding first. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about narcissistic psychology depending on external structures: attention, validation, narrative control, predictable emotional reactivity from the people around him, to generate a sense of self that his own internal architecture cannot reliably produce independently. This dependence, however sophisticated the tactics built around it, ultimately represents a fundamental vulnerability. He cannot function without external supply, which means his entire operational strategy requires successfully managing and extracting from other people in order to remain stable at all. An emotionally awakened empath operates from an entirely different foundation, one that produces something we might call structural invulnerability, at least in the specific sense that matters for this conversation. Remember everything we've traced throughout this series about what genuine healing actually produces: complete self-trust that doesn't require external validation to feel settled, genuine emotional sovereignty that allows full feeling without requiring anyone else's reaction to confirm its reality, discernment sophisticated enough to recognize manipulation immediately rather than requiring years of accumulated evidence. This foundation doesn't depend on external supply the way narcissistic psychology does. It generates its own stability internally, which means there's genuinely nothing left for a narcissist's usual tactics to extract or exploit. This is the first most fundamental way an awakened empath proves more dangerous than a narcissist. She cannot be controlled through any of the mechanisms his entire strategy depends on, while she retains full capacity to recognize, name, and respond to exactly the mechanisms he's using, precisely because her own healing required developing exhaustive, detailed understanding of manipulation tactics in order to survive and eventually transcend them. Here's the second dimension of this danger, one that connects to something we discussed extensively throughout our conversation about betraying a super empath. A narcissist's power depends heavily on narrative control, on his capacity to manage what other people believe about him regardless of what actually occurred. An emotionally awakened empath represents a uniquely severe threat to this narrative control, not because she's plotting to expose him, but because her perception has become sophisticated enough that his usual performance simply doesn't register as convincing to her anymore. She sees through exactly the mechanisms he's used successfully on almost everyone else in his life, and this seeing, once fully developed, cannot be argued away, gaslit into doubt, or successfully reframed because it was built through her own hard-won, thoroughly tested clarity rather than through anything he could ever successfully manipulate again. Here's the third dimension, one that touches something we traced throughout our conversation about why non-reactive empaths prove so difficult to manipulate: A narcissist's tactics depend on producing predictable emotional reactions he can then work with: anger to escalate, tears to exploit, confusion to deepen. An emotionally awakened empath offers none of this predictable material, not because she's suppressing genuine feeling, but because her feeling has become sophisticated enough to exist fully without requiring immediate, exploitable expression. This absence of predictable reactivity removes his entire operational toolkit, leaving him facing someone whose internal world remains genuinely, permanently inaccessible to his usual methods of reading and controlling it. Together, these three dimensions, invulnerability to his primary tactics, immunity to his narrative control, and unpredictability that removes his usual operational material, begin explaining why this specific kind of awakened empath represents something considerably more formidable than the narcissist who might have once believed himself capable of managing her indefinitely. Let's go deeper into what actually makes this danger so specifically severe, because understanding the full scope requires examining something we haven't yet fully addressed: the difference between an empath who has simply learned to protect herself and an empath who has genuinely, completely transcended the entire framework that once made her vulnerable in the first place. Here's the crucial distinction worth understanding. A narcissist can, at least in theory, adapt to and eventually work around someone who has simply learned defensive strategies: better boundaries, more discernment, reduced reactivity. These represent improvements, but they still exist within the same basic framework of the relationship he understands: a person managing herself in response to his behavior. What makes full emotional awakening categorically different and considerably more dangerous to his entire operational model is that it removes her from this framework altogether. She's no longer managing herself in relation to him. She's simply completely operating according to her own internal reality, one that exists genuinely independent of whatever he does, says, or attempts. This distinction matters enormously, and it connects directly to something we traced throughout our conversation about the only thing that actually works with a narcissist: genuine detachment. An awakened empath embodies this detachment not as a technique she's deploying, but as her actual, lived internal state. Remember what we established about why performed detachment eventually fails, why narcissists remain remarkably skilled at detecting the underlying need hiding beneath a calm surface. Genuine awakening removes exactly this underlying need, which means there's genuinely nothing left for his finely tuned detection system to find, no matter how carefully or persistently he searches for it. Here's the fourth dimension of this danger, one that deserves careful examination because it addresses something particularly threatening to a narcissist's entire psychological survival strategy: an emotionally awakened empath's capacity for genuine, complete indifference to his suffering, his struggle, his eventual breakdown, without that indifference requiring any cruelty on her part whatsoever. Remember what we traced throughout our conversation about the narcissist you left being on the verge of collapse: the specific hope that genuine suffering might finally produce some kind of pull toward reconciliation, toward compassionate intervention, toward exactly the caretaking response that once kept empaths trapped in these relationships for years. A fully awakened empath doesn't experience this pull, not because she's become cold or unfeeling, but because her compassion has become sophisticated enough to distinguish clearly between feeling genuine, complicated human emotion about someone's suffering and believing that feeling obligates any action whatsoever. This distinction, developed through exactly the kind of hard-won discernment we've traced throughout this entire series, removes one of the last remaining tools available to a narcissist facing genuine crisis: the hope that sufficient suffering, sufficient visible desperation, might eventually reactivate the caretaking instinct that once made her so exploitable in the first place. It doesn't reactivate, it simply genuinely doesn't, because that instinct has been fully, permanently separated from her own sense of obligation. Here's the fifth dimension worth understanding, one that connects to something we discussed extensively throughout our conversation about the one sentence that reveals genuine self-trust. An emotionally awakened empath's perception of reality has become genuinely, permanently independent of external validation, which means his usual tools for creating doubt, confusion, or destabilization simply have no foundation to work with anymore. Remember everything we've traced about gaslighting depending on the target's residual uncertainty about her own perception. This uncertainty, once genuinely resolved through the kind of thorough internal work we've discussed throughout this entire series, doesn't leave the smallest crack for gaslighting to eventually reopen, regardless of how sophisticated or persistent the attempt. This is worth sitting with directly because it reveals something important about why this specific combination, depth of feeling paired with complete clarity, produces something qualitatively different from either quality alone. Depth of feeling without clarity produces exactly the exploitable vulnerability narcissists have historically depended on: genuine compassion that can be weaponized, genuine trust that can be betrayed, genuine hope that can be exploited indefinitely. Clarity without depth of feeling produces something considerably more limited: cold, calculated self-protection that might successfully avoid exploitation, but that lacks the genuine warmth and connection that makes an awakened empath's presence so significant to the people who genuinely deserve access to it. Full emotional awakening combines both qualities simultaneously, producing something that retains all the genuine depth, all the genuine capacity for connection and compassion, while pairing it with clarity sophisticated enough that none of this depth remains available for exploitation by anyone who hasn't genuinely earned access to it. This combination is precisely what makes an awakened empath so uniquely formidable against narcissistic strategy, because his entire operational model depends on being able to separate genuine feeling from protective clarity, exploiting the first while eroding the second. An awakened empath has fused these two qualities so completely that separating them, from his perspective, becomes genuinely impossible. There's a sixth dimension worth naming directly, one that addresses why this particular combination proves so threatening even to narcissists who've never directly interacted with this specific empath before. Remember what we discussed extensively about narcissistic supply seeking, depending on identifying and exploiting specific vulnerabilities during the earliest stages of any new connection. An awakened empath's presence, precisely because it lacks these exploitable vulnerabilities, often produces immediate, instinctive avoidance from narcissists encountering her for the first time. An unconscious recognition that whatever tactics have worked reliably on almost everyone else simply won't find purchase here. This isn't something she has to work to produce. It's simply the natural, automatic effect of her fully integrated psychological state, one that narcissistic instinct, finely tuned to detect exploitability, recognizes and avoids almost immediately. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward, and it's worth being direct about it rather than leaving this conversation as simply a fascinating comparison of psychological power without addressing what it actually means for how you understand and carry forward your own awakening if you recognize yourself somewhere in everything we've discussed today. The first thing worth understanding clearly is that this danger we've spent this entire conversation examining was never actually built for confrontation, and understanding this distinction matters enormously for how you use everything we've traced today. Remember something we've returned to throughout this entire series in different forms. Real power here doesn't come from successfully defeating or outmaneuvering a narcissist through clever strategy. It comes from becoming someone whose entire way of existing genuinely no longer requires his cooperation, his validation, or even his acknowledgement of what he's encountering in order to remain completely, permanently intact. The danger we've described today isn't a weapon you wield deliberately. It's simply what naturally results from complete, genuine wholeness, encountered by a psychological structure that has no framework for processing something it cannot exploit, control, or destabilize. This distinction protects you from a specific misunderstanding that could otherwise undermine everything genuine awakening actually represents. If you find yourself thinking about this danger as something to deploy strategically, something to consciously wield against anyone attempting to manipulate or exploit you, you've likely misunderstood the nature of what we've been describing throughout this entire conversation. Genuine emotional awakening doesn't produce a weapon you consciously use. It produces a state of being so complete, so genuinely independent of external validation, that its effects on narcissistic psychology occur simply as a natural byproduct, without requiring any deliberate strategy or intentional confrontation on your part at all. Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about the actual path toward this kind of awakening, rather than simply describing its eventual effects once achieved. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about what genuine healing actually requires. The grief fully processed rather than bypassed. The self-trust rebuilt through sustained, deliberate practice rather than simple decision. The alternative sources of meaning and validation genuinely developed rather than assumed automatically. The patience required to let all of this accumulate over real time rather than expecting it to arrive through understanding alone. This means the danger we've spent this entire conversation examining isn't something available to claim simply by understanding the concept intellectually, however thoroughly. It's the natural result of doing the actual work, sustained over considerable time, that we've traced throughout this entire series in dozens of different conversations, each addressing a different facet of what genuine transformation actually requires. If you recognize yourself as still somewhere earlier in this journey, still working through grief, still rebuilding self-trust, still developing the alternative sources of meaning that eventually make external validation genuinely unnecessary, understand that this is exactly where the real work actually lives, considerably more valuable than any single insight about what eventual awakening might someday produce. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that circles back to something crucial we should address directly before closing. Why frame this specific quality as dangerous at all, rather than simply describing it as healed, whole, or free? This framing matters because it captures something important about how narcissistic psychology specifically experiences encountering this kind of wholeness, something that goes beyond simple disappointment at losing a source of supply. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation about how thoroughly this specific combination, depth paired with clarity, dismantles every tool his psychology depends on. From his perspective, encountering someone genuinely permanently immune to every strategy that's worked reliably throughout his entire life doesn't register as simple loss. It registers as something closer to existential threat, a confrontation with the possibility that his entire operational model of how relationships and power actually work might carry limitations his psychology has spent decades successfully avoiding having to acknowledge. This is precisely why dangerous captures something accurate that gentler language might miss. An awakened empath isn't simply someone who has learned to protect herself adequately. She represents, from the specific perspective of narcissistic psychology, a genuine threat to the fundamental assumptions his entire strategy depends on, assumptions he's likely never had to question with this level of forced clarity before. Here's the fourth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this conversation. If you're currently in the process of your own awakening, currently doing the work we've traced throughout this entire series, understand that the eventual effect this produces on any narcissist you encounter was never actually the point of the journey. It's simply an incidental, natural byproduct of something considerably more valuable: your own genuine wholeness, your own genuine freedom, your own genuine capacity to move through the world fully feeling, fully connected, and fully protected simultaneously, in a way that no longer requires choosing between depth and safety, between compassion and discernment, between genuine feeling and genuine strength. This is what full emotional awakening actually produces, and understanding why it proves more dangerous than narcissistic psychology, in the specific sense we've traced throughout this entire conversation, ultimately matters less for what it tells you about defeating anyone who might try to exploit you, and more for what it reveals about the genuine, complete wholeness available to you once this work is genuinely, thoroughly done. You were never actually trying to become dangerous. You were simply trying to become whole. The danger, when it appears, is simply what wholeness looks like from the perspective of something that was only ever able to survive by consuming what you used to give away freely, before you finally completely learned you were never required to keep giving it at all.